Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much and enjoy your audiobook.
There were 4 propeller engines, and along one side the name Heracles sprawled in large red letters. I climbed up the steps into the flight cabin, and here the impression of age and a long, hard life was stronger still. The black paintwork had almost been rubbed away from the bank of dials and levers in the cockpit, leaving the bare metal gleaming through, and the seats showed the outline of their contents bulging dangerously against their leather coverings. A curtain, when drawn aside, revealed a toilet of the most primitive type. This was indeed an elderly aeroplane. I looked back wonderingly at the enormous empty belly stretching away to the tail, and at that moment Mr. Costain poked his head in from the steps. "Tremendous, isn't it?" he said. "It was used as a troop carrier and general transport during the war." I nodded silently. That was quite a long time ago. We walked back together to the airport terminal and had a cup of tea and a sandwich while keeping an eye open for the arrival of the cattle. I learned that we were taking 40 pedigree cows and heifers, and as the time stretched round to 6:30, I wondered just how they were going to be loaded in time for an 8 o'clock takeoff. At length, 2 cattle wagons rumbled onto the airfield, and we hurried to meet them. I was pleased and relieved to find that 2 Jersey farmers were joining us on the flight, and I was introduced to them before the loading started. They were both dark-haired and spoke with a slow drawl very different from my Yorkshire clients. Noel would be in his early 30s, smiling, and with an ingenuous air about him. Joe, probably 10 years older, similarly amiable, but it seemed to me a hard man at bottom. He was easy to like, but I couldn't imagine him suffering fools gladly. It didn't take me long to realize that the 2 of them knew what they were doing. One of the Globemaster's crew, a little Dane called Carl, operated an electric hoist with tubular metal sides, which descended from the underside of the aircraft while Joe and Noel led the cattle up a ramp and jockeyed them into position until the hoist was full and they could be lifted up. Above, in the cavernous interior, they arranged the animals in rows of 6 facing the front, with a metal tube clamped behind each row. Those farmers were good stocksmen. There was no shouting, no brandishing of sticks, just a continual gentle nudging and pushing and soft words of encouragement. And of course, they had the ideal subjects to handle. I've often said that I wished all cows were Jerseys, and I felt it again that day. I do not think I've ever seen a more beautiful group of cattle. Mostly heifers with a few young cows, and all of them fine-boned and graceful, with their lambent, kind eyes regarding us with mild interest as they took their places. It was a steamy, hot London evening, and as Joe and Noel toiled, the sweat streamed down their faces. But, like my Yorkshire farmers, hard work seemed to be something they took for granted. Sleeves rolled high on their sunburned arms, they kept at it without pausing. More than half the animals had been loaded when the main members of the crew arrived. Captain Birch looked down at me from a gaunt 6'4" as he shook hands, and the sombre face above the black, grey-flecked beard emanated authority. This was a man of formidable presence. The co-pilot and navigator, Ed, and the engineer, Dave, were in their 20s and grinned cheerfully as they hoisted their bags into the flight cabin. The captain was English and dressed in a formal dark uniform, but these young men were American, and their clothing intrigued me. They wore white, loose-fitting jackets and trousers of a lightweight material which, with their peaked caps cocked at an angle, gave them a carefree appearance. As I thought, there was no possibility of an 8 o'clock takeoff, and it was nearly 11 when the last heifer was loaded and clamped in safely. The 40 cattle were quite a sight as they stood patiently in their rows, their feet deep in straw, and an armful of hay in front of each of them. The long stretch of backs made a ripple of fawn gold under the interior lights of the aircraft. One snag was that the heat and the packed interior was almost overpowering, and I prayed that some ventilation would come into operation when we were airborne. Mr. Costain prepared to leave. He had spent quite a long time in a financial negotiation, almost a wrangle with the captain, about the cost of the transportation, and I gathered that the captain either owned the aircraft personally or was a top director of the firm which did. They came to an agreement at last, and Mr. Costain shook my hand. "Have a good trip, Mr. Herriot," he said. You will be refuelling in Rome and reach Istanbul early tomorrow. I know you'll love that city. Goodbye." The thought of this huge, heavily loaded aeroplane landing anywhere on those bald tires gave me a moment of disquiet, but I put it out of my mind and sat down with Joe and Noel on one of the battered seats in the cabin. We waited and waited for something to happen. But a seemingly interminable discussion was going on in the cockpit. The humans in the aircraft were quite clearly in two camps, the crew and the cattlemen, and the only attention we three got during this period was a piercing look from the captain and a stern admonition. "You'll look after these cattle, won't you? They are very valuable, and they're my responsibility. You'll keep a constant eye on them, I hope?" "Of course," I replied. "That's what we're here for." I spoke confidently, but I had no idea how the animals would react when this monster began to roar its way into the sky. If they started to run amok and break their legs, there wasn't much I could do but use my humane killer, and I didn't think the captain would be overjoyed at that. The two farmers and I talked in the dimly lit cabin during the long wait. They told me of their stock troubles, and I described the veterinary life in Yorkshire. Then, to our relief, around 1 a.m., the aircraft's engine began to cough into life. We actually started to taxi along to the end of the runway. This was the moment I had been waiting for, and I turned in my seat and gazed over the 40 sleek backs as the aircraft began to roll. The engines bellowed. The vast frame shook and juddered as the machine hurtled down the runway. Then there was the wrench of liftoff and the sensation of climbing. And all those cattle did was sway gently from side to side, their eyes looking at me, calm and untroubled. Some even nibbled at their hay as we rose into the night sky. Thank heaven. Flying seemed to be second nature to them, and I was relaxing happily when I noticed a commotion in the cabin. The huge undercarriage had not retracted fully, and Carl, Dave, and Ed were pulling with all their strength on the loop attached to it. After a few moments of concentrated effort, the wheels came up with a clunk and the crewmen returned to their places. They did this calmly, as though it was a regular procedure. I wondered idly how many other things didn't work on this aeroplane. I was grateful for one thing. My worries about the heat had been groundless because as we climbed, the atmosphere became steadily colder. It had been a long day for Noel, Joe, and me. We had left home early that morning, and we dozed fitfully on the uncomfortable seats in the semi-darkness, glancing at our charges from time to time. After a few hours, I was jerked to wakefulness. We were coming into land, descending quickly over the lights of an airfield. I watched the cattle again as we bumped and rattled along the runway, but they took it all with the same aplomb as before. When we halted, I looked out at a brightly lit sign. Munchen. "Refueling?" Carl muttered. Mr. Costain said it would be Rome, and it was Munich. The nagging little thought returned that nothing about this trip since John Crooks first drew the scenario had turned out as expected. Anyway, we had landed safely on those awful tires, and we took off too without disaster, although once more Carl and Dave had to haul with all their might until the undercarriage thumped into position. By 5 a.m., the two farmers and I were weary and desperate to stretch our cramped limbs. Finally, Joe beckoned to us to follow him, and we groped our way down by the side of the animals right to the tail of the aircraft where a deep pile of hay was lying. He stretched out, and Noel and I followed suit. Again, this was different from my friend John's bed in his cabin on the Mediterranean, but it was heaven. I closed my eyes and floated away. The captain had adjured us to do our duty carefully, but I couldn't keep my eyes open any more. And though I was thousands of feet up somewhere in the dark skies above Yugoslavia, I might have been back in Darrowby, because the scents and the sounds were the same. The fragrance of hay, the sweet bovine smell, and the soft grunting, coughing and champing of many cattle. These were familiar things, and they lulled me into slumber within minutes. Bright sunshine was streaming into the aircraft when I opened my eyes again. I looked at my watch. 7 o'clock. The two farmers were still nestled motionless in the hay, and I got to my feet and looked with a touch of anxiety along the rows of cattle. I need not have worried. They were as contented as if they had been in their byres in Jersey. Some were lying in the straw, others stood chewing their cud. It was a peaceful scene. It was not peaceful, however, in the flight cabin and cockpit. In fact, as I gazed beyond the animals to the front of the aircraft, I could see evidence of intense activity. The crew members were leaping around, staring at the starboard window and operating controls which I couldn't see. I pushed my way past the metal standings to the cabin and had a look for myself. The starboard inner engine had been switched off, and its 4 propeller blades hung motionless as oil gushed from its interior, spiralling into the flawless blue of the sky, flowing in black tendrils over the wing and spattering against the window. Nobody bothered to say good morning to me. There was no panic, but there was definitely consternation. As I looked, I saw that there was something more alarming than an oil leak. Flames were licking around the engine cowling, and a long tongue of fire crept back towards the wing. I scarcely had time to digest the meaning of all this when the flames disappeared, apparently extinguished by the crew's efforts. There was a general relaxation in the cockpit, and some wan smiles were exchanged. I heard a whisper in my ear. "Some bloody aeroplane this, Jim boy." Joe had joined me at the window and was looking with disbelief at the still, scarred engine. Behind him, Noel was wide-eyed but silent. On our 3 engines, we flew on through the cloudless sky, and below a turquoise sea sparkled. Soon we began to lose height, and I looked down on a great city with domes and minarets abounding. This was indeed some bloody aeroplane, but it had got us to Istanbul. Chapter 30. Mr. Garrett's words about parents needing nerves of steel have come back to me many times over the years. One notable occasion was the annual recital given by Miss Livingstone's piano class. Miss Livingstone was a soft-voiced, charming lady in her 50s who started many of the local children in piano lessons, and once a year she held a concert in the Methodist Hall for her pupils to show their paces. They ranged from 6-year-olds to teenagers, and the room was packed with their proud parents. Jimmy was 9 at the time and had been practicing without much enthusiasm for the big day. Everybody knows everybody else in a small town like Darrowby, and as the place filled up and the chairs scraped into position, there was much nodding and smiling as people recognized each other. I found myself on the outside chair of the centre aisle with Helen on my right, and just across the few feet of space I saw Jeff Ward, old Willie Richardson's cowman, sitting very upright, hands on knees. He was dressed in his Sunday best, and the dark serge was stretched tightly across his muscular frame. His red, strong-boned face shone with intensive scrubbing, and his normally wayward thatch of hair was plastered down with brilliantine. "Hello, Jeff," I said. "One of your youngsters performing today?" He turned and grinned. "Now then, Mr. Herriot. Aye, it's our Margaret. She's been coming on right well on piano, and I just hope she does herself justice this afternoon." "Of course she will, Jeff. Miss Livingstone is an excellent teacher. She'll do fine." He nodded and turned to the front as the concert commenced. The first few performers who mounted the platform were very small boys in shorts and socks, or tiny girls in frilly dresses, and their feet dangled far above the pedals as they sat at the keyboard. Miss Livingstone hovered nearby to prompt them, but their little mistakes were greeted with indulgent smiles from the assembly, and the conclusion of each piece was greeted with thunderous applause. I noticed, however, that as the children grew bigger and the pieces became more difficult, a certain tension began to build up in the hall. The errors weren't so funny now, and when little Jenny Newcomb, the fruiterer's daughter, halted a couple of times, then bowed her head as though she were about to cry, the silence in the room was absolute and charged with anxiety. I could feel it myself. My nails were digging into my palms and my teeth were tightly clenched. When Jenny successfully restarted and I relaxed with all the others, the realization burst upon me that we were not just a roomful of parents watching our children perform. We were a band of brothers and sisters, suffering together. When little Margaret Ward climbed the few steps to the platform, her father stiffened perceptibly in his seat. From the corner of my eyes I could see Jeff's big, work-roughened fingers clutching tightly at his knees. Margaret went on very nicely till she came to a rather complicated chord which jarred on the company with harsh dissonance. She knew she had got the notes wrong, and tried again, and again, and again, each time jerking her head with the effort. "No. C and E, dear," murmured Miss Livingstone, and Margaret crashed her fingers down once more, violently and wrongly. "My God, she's not going to make it," I breathed to myself, aware suddenly that my pulse was racing and that every muscle in my body was rigid. I glanced round at Jeff. It was impossible for anybody with his complexion to turn pale, but his face had assumed a hideously mottled appearance, and his legs were twitching convulsively. He seemed to sense that my gaze was on him, because he turned tortured eyes towards me and gave me the ghastly semblance of a smile. Just beyond, his wife was leaning forward. Her mouth hung slightly open and her lips trembled. As Margaret fought for the right notes, a total silence and immobility settled on the packed hall. It seemed an eternity before the little girl got it right and galloped away over the rest of the piece, and though everybody relaxed in their seats and applauded with relief as much as approval, I had the feeling that the episode had taken its toll on all of us. I certainly didn't feel so good, and watched in a half-trance as a succession of children went up and did their thing without incident. Then it was Jimmy's turn. There was no doubt that most of the performers and parents were suffering from nerves, but this couldn't be applied to my son. He almost whistled as he trotted up the steps, and there was a hint of a swagger in his walk up to the piano. This, he clearly thought, was going to be a doddle. In marked contrast, I went into a sort of rigour as soon as he appeared. My palms broke out in an instant sweat, and I found I was breathing only with difficulty. I told myself that this was utterly ridiculous, but it was no good. It was how I felt. Jimmy's piece was called The Miller's Dance, a title which is burned on my brain till the day I die. It was a rollicking little melody, which of course I knew down to the last semi-quaver, and Jimmy started off in great style, throwing his hands about and tossing his head like Arthur Rubinstein in full flow. Around the middle of The Miller's Dance, there is a pause in the quick tempo, where the music goes from a brisk ta-rum-tum-tiddle-iddle-om-pom-pom to a lingering ta-rum, 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 before starting off again at top speed. It was a clever little ploy by the composer and gave a touch of variety to the whole thing. Jimmy dashed up to this point with flailing arms till he slowed down to the familiar ta-rum, ta-rum, ta-rum. I waited for him to take off again, but nothing happened. He stopped and looked down fixedly at the keys for a few seconds. Then he played the slow bit again, and halted once more. My heart gave a great thud. "Come on, lad. You know the next part. I've heard you play it 100 times. My voiceless plea was born of desperation, but Jimmy didn't seem troubled at all. He looked down with mild puzzlement and rubbed his chin a few times. Miss Livingstone's gentle voice came over the quivering silence. "Perhaps you'd better start at the beginning again, Jimmy." "Okay." My son's tone was perky as he plunged confidently into the melody again, and I closed my eyes as he approached the fateful bars. Ta-rum, tum, tiddle-iddle-om-pom-pom, ta-rum, 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 then nothing. This time he pursed his lips, put his hands on his knees, and bent closely over the keyboard as though the strips of ivory were trying to hide something from him. He showed no sign of panic, only a faint curiosity. In the almost palpable hush of that room, I was sure that the hammering of my heart must be audible. I could feel Helen's leg trembling against mine. I knew we couldn't take much more of this. Miss Livingstone's voice was soft as a zephyr, or I think I would have screamed. "Jimmy, dear, shall we try it once more from the beginning?" Yes, right." Away he went again, like a hurricane, all fire and fury. It was unbelievable that there could ever be a flaw in such virtuosity. The whole room was in agony. By now the other parents had come to know The Miller's Dance almost as well as I did, and we waited together for the dread passage. Jimmy came out to it at breakneck speed. Ta-rum-tum, tiddle-iddle-om-pom-pom, then ta-rum, 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 and silence. Helen's knees were definitely knocking now, and I stole an anxious glance at her face. She was pale, but she didn't look ready to faint just yet. As Jimmy sat motionless except for a thoughtful drumming of his fingers against the woodwork of the piano, I felt I was going to choke. I glared around me desperately, and I saw that Jeff Ward across the aisle was in a bad way. His face had gone all blotchy again, and his jaw muscles stood out in taut ridges, and a light sheen of perspiration covered his forehead. Something had to break soon, and once more it was Miss Livingstone's voice which cut into the terrible atmosphere. "All right, Jimmy dear," she said. "Never mind. Perhaps you'd better go and sit down now." My son rose from the stool and marched across the platform. He descended the steps and rejoined his fellow pupils in the first few rows. I slumped back in my seat. Ah, well, that was it. The final indignity. The poor little lad had blown it. And though he didn't seem troubled, I was sure he must feel a sense of shame at being unable to get through his piece. A wave of misery enveloped me, and though many of the other parents turned and directed sickly smiles of sympathy and friendship at Helen and me, it didn't help. I hardly heard the rest of the concert, which was a pity because as the bigger boys and girls began to perform, the musical standard rose to remarkable heights. Chopin nocturnes were followed by Mozart sonatas, and I had a dim impression of a tall lad rendering an impromptu by Schubert. It was a truly splendid show by everybody but poor old Jimmy, the only one who hadn't managed to finish. At the end, Miss Livingstone came to the front of the platform. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the kind reception you have given my pupils. I do hope you have enjoyed it as much as we have." There was more clapping, and as the chairs started to push back, I rose to my feet, feeling slightly sick. "Shall we go then, Helen?" I said, and my wife nodded back at me, her face a doleful mask. But Miss Livingstone wasn't finished yet. "Just one thing more, ladies and gentlemen." She raised a hand. "There is a young man here who I know can do much better. I wouldn't be happy going home now without giving him another opportunity. Jimmy?" She beckoned towards the second row. "Jimmy, I wonder if you'd like to have one more try." As Helen and I exchanged horrified glances, there was an immediate response from the front. Our son's voice rang out, chirpy and confident. Aye, I'll have a go." I couldn't believe it. The martyrdom was surely not about to start all over again, but it was true. Everybody was sitting down, and a small, familiar figure was mounting the steps and striding to the piano. From a great distance I heard Miss Livingstone again. "Jimmy will play The Miller's Dance." She didn't have to tell us. We all knew. As though in the middle of a bad dream, I resumed my seat. A few seconds earlier, I had been conscious only of a great weariness, but now I was gripped by a fiercer tension than I had known all afternoon. As Jimmy poised his hands over the keys, a vibrant sense of strain lapped around the silent room. The little lad started off as he always did, as though he hadn't a care in the world, and I began a series of long, shuddering breaths designed to carry me past the moment which was fast approaching. Because I knew he would stop again, and I knew just as surely that when he did, I would topple senseless to the floor. I didn't dare look round at anybody. In fact, when he reached the crucial bars, I closed my eyes tightly, but I could still hear the music, so very clearly. Ta-rum-rum, tiddle-iddle-lum-pom-pom, ta-rum, ta-rum, ta-rum. There was a pause of unbearable length. Then, tiddle-iddle-lum-pom, tiddle-iddle-lum-pom. Jimmy was blissfully on his way again. He raced through the second half of the piece, but I kept my eyes closed as the relief flooded through me. I opened them only when he came to the finale, which I knew so well. Jimmy was making a real meal of it, head down, fingers thumping, and at the last crashing chord he held out one hand in a flourish, a foot above the keyboard, before letting it fall by his side in the true manner of the concert pianist. I doubt if the Methodist Hall had ever heard such a noise like the great cheer which followed. The place erupted in a storm of clapping and shouting, and Jimmy was not the man to ignore such an accolade. All the other children had walked impassively from the stage at the end of their efforts, but not so my son. To my astonishment, he strode from the stool to the front of the platform, placed one arm across his abdomen and the other behind his back, extended one foot and bowed to one side of the audience with the grace of an 18th century courtier. He then reversed arms and pushed out the other foot before repeating his bow to the other side of the hall. The cheering changed to a great roar of laughter, which continued as he descended the steps, smiling demurely. Everybody was still giggling as we made our way out. In the doorway we bumped into Miss Mullion, who ran the little school which our son attended. She was dabbing her eyes. "Oh dear," she said breathlessly. "You can always depend on Jimmy to provide the light relief." I drove back to Skeldale House very slowly. I was still in a weak condition, and I felt it dangerous to exceed 25 miles an hour. The colour had returned to Helen's face, but there were lines of exhaustion around her mouth and eyes as she stared ahead through the windscreen. Jimmy in the back was lying full length along the seat, kicking his legs in the air and whistling some of the tunes which had been played that afternoon. "Mum, Dad!" he exclaimed in the staccato manner which was so typical of him. "I like music." I glanced at him in the driving mirror. "That's good, son. That's good. So do we." Suddenly he rolled off the back seat and thrust his head between us. "Do you know why I like music so much?" I shook my head. "I've just found out," he cried delightedly. "It's because it's so soothing." Chapter 31. When Walt Barnett asked me to see his cat, I was surprised. He had employed other veterinary surgeons ever since Siegfried had mortally offended him by charging him £10 for castrating a horse, and that had been a long time ago. I was surprised, too, that a man like him should concern himself with the ailments of a cat. A lot of people said Walt Barnett was the richest man in Darrowby, rolling in brass, which he made from his many and diverse enterprises. He was mainly a scrap merchant, but he had a haulage business, too, and he was a dealer in second-hand cars, furniture, anything, in fact, that came his way. I knew he kept some livestock and horses around his big house outside the town, but there was money in these things, and money was the ruling passion of his life. There was no profit in cat-keeping. Another thing which puzzled me as I drove to his office was that owning a pet indicated some warmth of character, a vein of sentiment, however small. It just didn't fit in with his nature. I picked my way through the litter of the scrapyard to the wooden shed in the corner from which the empire was run. Walt Barnett was sitting behind a cheap desk, and he was exactly as I remembered him. The massive body stretching the seams of his shiny navy blue suit, the cigarette dangling from his lips, even the brown trilby hat perched on the back of his head. Unchanged, too, was the beefy red face with its arrogant expression and hostile eyes. "Over there," he said, glowering at me, and poking a finger at a black-and-white cat sitting among the papers on the desk. It was a typical greeting. I hadn't expected him to say good morning or anything like that, and he never smiled. I reached across the desk and tickled the animal's cheek, and was rewarded with a rich purring and an arching of the back against my hand. He was a big Tom, long-haired and attractively marked, with a white breast and white paws, and though I have always had a predilection for tabbies, I took an immediate liking to this cat. He exuded friendliness. "Nice cat," I said. "What's the trouble?" "It's his leg. There's something wrong with that one there. Must have cut himself." I felt among the fluffy hair, and the little creature flinched as I reached the point halfway up the limb. I took out my scissors and clipped a clear area. I could see a transverse wound, quite deep and discharging a thin, serous fluid. Yes, this could be a cut, but there's something unusual about it. I can't see how he's done it. Does he go out in the yard much? The big man nodded. Aye, wanders around a bit. Ah, well, he may have caught it on some sharp object. I'll give him a penicillin injection and leave you a tube of ointment to squeeze into the wound night and morning. Some cats strongly object to hypodermics, and since their armoury includes claws as well as teeth, they can be difficult, but this one never moved. In fact, the purring increased in volume as I inserted the needle. "He really is good-natured," I said. "What do you call him?" "Fred." Walt Barnett looked at me expressionlessly. There didn't appear to be anything particularly apposite about the name, but the man's face discouraged further comment. I produced the ointment from my bag and placed it on the desk. "Right, let me know if he doesn't improve." I received no reply, neither acknowledgement nor goodbye, and I took my leave feeling the same prickle of resentment as when I first encountered his boorishness. But as I walked across the yard, I forgot my annoyance in my preoccupation with the case. There was something very peculiar about that wound. It didn't look like an accidental laceration. It was neat and deep, as though somebody had drawn a razor blade across the flesh. I listened as I had listened so often before to that little inner voice, the voice that said things were not as they seemed. A touch on my arm brought me out of my musings. One of the men who had been working among the scrap was looking at me conspiratorially. "You been in to see Big Boss?" "Yes." "Funny thing, tal bugger bothering about a cat, eh?" "I suppose so. How long has he had it?" "Oh, about 2 years now. It was a stray. Ran into his office one day, and knowing him, I thought he'd have booted it straight out, but he didn't. Adopted it instead. I can't reckon it up. It sits there all day on his desk." "He must like it," I said. "Him? He doesn't like anything or anybody. He's a—" A bellow from the office doorway cut him short. "Hey, you! Get on with your bloody work!" Walt Barnett, huge and menacing, brandished a fist, and the man, after one terrified glance, scuttled away. As I got into my car, the thought stayed with me that this was how Walt Barnett lived, surrounded by fear and hate. His ruthlessness was a byword in the town, and though no doubt it made him rich, I didn't envy him. I heard his voice on the phone 2 days later. "Get out here sharpish and see that cat." "Isn't that wound any better?" "No, it's worse, so don't be long." Fred was in his usual place on the desk, and he purred as I went up and stroked him. But the leg was certainly more painful. It was disappointing, but what really baffled me was that the wound was bigger instead of smaller. It was still the same narrow slit in the skin, but it had undoubtedly lengthened. It was as though it was trying to creep its way round the leg. I had brought some extra instruments with me, and I passed a metal probe gently into the depths of the cut. I could feel something down there, something which caught the ends of the probe and sprang away. I followed with long forceps and gripped the unknown object before it could escape. When I brought it to the surface and saw the narrow brown strand, all became suddenly clear. "He's got an elastic band round his leg," I said. I snipped the thing through, withdrew it, and dropped it on the desk. "There it is. He'll be all right now." Walt Barnett jerked himself upright in his chair. "Elastic band? Why the hell didn't you find it first time?" He had me there. Why the hell hadn't I? In those days, my eyesight was perfect. But on that first visit, all I had seen was a little break in the skin. "I'm sorry, Mr. Barnett," I said. "The elastic was embedded in the flesh out of sight." It was true, but I didn't feel proud. He puffed rapidly at the ever-present cigarette. "And how did it get there?" "Somebody put it on his leg, without a doubt." "Put it on? What for?" "Oh, people do that to cats. I've heard of cases like this, but never actually seen one. There are some cruel folk around." "One of them fellas in the yard, I'll wager." "Not necessarily. Fred goes out in the street, doesn't he?" "Oh, aye, often." "Well, it could have been anybody." Buddy. There was a long silence as the big man sat scowling, his eyes half closed. I wondered if he was going over the list of his enemies. That would take some time. "Anyway," I said, "the leg will heal very quickly now. That's the main thing." Walt Barnett reached across the desk and slowly rubbed the cat's side with a sausage-like forefinger. I had seen him do this several times during my previous visit. It was an odd, unsmiling gesture, but probably the nearest he could get to a caress. On my way back to the surgery, I slumped low in the car seat, hardly daring to think of what would have happened if I hadn't found that elastic. Arrest of circulation, gangrene, loss of the foot, or even death. I broke into a sweat at the thought. Walt Barnett was on the phone 3 weeks later, and I felt a twinge of apprehension at the sound of the familiar voice. Maybe I wasn't out of the wood yet. "Is his leg still troubling him?" I asked. No, that's healed up. There's something matter with his head. His head? Aye. Keeps cocking it from side to side. Come and see him. This sounded to me like canker. And in fact, when I saw the cat sitting on the desk, twisting his head around uneasily, I was sure that was it. But the ears were clean and painless. This amiable cat seemed to like being examined, and the purring rose to a crescendo as I made a close inspection of his teeth, mouth, eyes, and nostrils. Nothing. Yet something up there was causing a lot of discomfort. I began to work my way through the black hair, and suddenly the purring was interrupted by a sharp meow as my fingers came upon a painful spot on his neck. "Something here," I murmured. I took out my scissors and began to clip. And as the hair fell away and the skin showed through, a wave of disbelief swept through me. I was looking down at a neat little transverse slit, the identical twin of the one I had seen before. My God, surely not on the neck. I went into the wound with probe and forceps, and within seconds I had brought the familiar brown band to the surface. A quick snip, and I pulled it clear. "More elastic," I said dully. "Round his neck?" "Afraid so. Somebody really meant business this time." He drew his enormous forefinger along the furry flank, and the cat rubbed delightedly against him. "Who's doing this?" I shrugged. "No way of telling. The police are always on the lookout for cruelty, but they would have to catch a person actually in the act." I knew he was wondering when the next attempt would come, and so was I. But there were no more elastic bands for Fred. The neck healed rapidly, and I didn't see the cat for nearly a year, till one morning Helen met me as I was coming in from my round. "Walt Barnett's been on the phone, Jim. Would you please go at once? He thinks his cat has been poisoned." Another attack on this nice little animal, and after all this time. It didn't make sense, and my mind was a jumble as I hurried into Walt Barnett's office. I found a vastly different Fred this time. The cat was not on his old place on the desk, but was crouched on the floor among a litter of newspapers. He didn't look up, but as I bent over him, he retched and vomited a yellow fluid onto the paper. More vomit lay around among pools of diarrhea which had the same yellowish hue. Walt Barnett, overflowing the chair behind the desk, spoke past the dangling cigarette. "He's poisoned, isn't he? Somebody's given him something." "It's possible." I watched the cat move slowly to a saucer of milk and sit over it in the same crouching attitude. He didn't drink, but sat looking down with a curious immobility. There was a sad familiarity in the little animal's appearance. This could be something worse even than poison. "Well, it is, isn't it?" the big man went on. "Somebody's tried to kill him again." "I'm not sure." As I took the cat's temperature, there was none of the purring or outgoing friendliness I had known before. He was sunk in a profound lethargy. The temperature was 105 degrees Fahrenheit. I palpated the abdomen, feeling the doughy consistency of the bowels, the lack of muscular tone. "Well, if it's not that, what is it?" "It's feline enteritis, I'm nearly certain." He looked at me blankly. "Some people call it cat distemper," I said. "There's an outbreak in Darrowby just now. I've seen several cases lately, and Fred's symptoms are typical." The big man heaved his bulk from behind the desk, went over to the cat and rubbed his forefinger along the unheeding back. "Well, if it's that, can you cure him?" "I'll do my best, Mr. Barnett, but the mortality rate is very high." "You mean most of them die?" "I'm afraid so." "How can that be? I thought you fellas had all them wonderful new medicines now." "Yes, but this is a virus, and viruses are resistant to antibiotics." "All right, then." Wheezing, he drew himself upright and returned to his chair. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to start right now," I said. I injected electrolytic fluid to combat the dehydration. I gave antibiotics against the secondary bacteria, and finished with a sedative to control the vomiting. But I knew that everything I had done was merely supportive. I had never had much luck with feline enteritis. I visited Fred each morning, and the very sight of him made me unhappy. He was either hunched over the saucer, or he was curled up on the desk in a little basket. He had no interest in the world around him. He never moved when I gave him his injections. It was like pushing a needle into a lifeless animal, and on the fourth morning I could see that he was sinking rapidly. "I'll call in tomorrow," I said, and Walt Barnett nodded without speaking. He had shown no emotion throughout the cat's illness. The next day, when I entered the office, I found the usual scene. The huge figure in his chair, brown trilby on the back of his head, cigarette hanging from his lips, the cat in the basket on the desk. Fred was still, and as I approached, I saw with a dull feeling of inevitability that he was not breathing. I put my stethoscope over his heart for a few moments and then looked up. "I'm afraid he's dead, Mr. Barnett." The big man did not change expression. He reached slowly across and rubbed his forefinger against the dark fur in that familiar gesture. Then he put his elbows on the desk and covered his face with his hands. I didn't know what to say, but watched helplessly as his shoulders began to shake and tears welled between the thick fingers. He stayed like that for some time. Then he spoke. "He was my friend," he said. I still could find no words, and the silence was heavy in the room until he suddenly pulled his hands from his face. He glared at me defiantly. I know what you're thinking. This is that big tough bugger Walt Barnett crying his eyes out over a cat. What a joke. I reckon you'll have a bloody good laugh later on." Evidently he was sure that what he considered a display of weakness would lower my opinion of him, and yet he was so wrong. I have liked him better ever since. Chapter 32. August the 9th, 1963. There was a general chattering and lightening of spirits when we landed safely and taxied to a halt. With everybody else, I climbed out and looked around. We were standing on a wide, concreted airfield. Nearby there was a hangar. Away on the other side, a long stretch of coarse grass ran down to the sea, and over everything the beautiful hot sunshine washed in a comforting flood. The airport buildings were about a quarter of a mile away, and far beyond, in the shimmering heat haze, I could just make out the high buildings of the city. It was just 8 o'clock. We would unload the cattle, and then there would be most of the day to explore Istanbul. I felt a tinge of excitement at the prospect. The two farmers were soon ready for action, jackets off, sleeves rolled up. Noel grinned at me as he flexed his muscles after the long night of inactivity. "Where are the wagons?" he asked. It was a good question. Where indeed were they? They should have been awaiting our arrival, but I scanned the airfield in vain. Carl went over to the buildings to make inquiries, but returned looking despondent. "Nobody knows," he said. "We wait." So we waited, as the sun beat on the concrete and the sweat trickled inside our shirts. It was over an hour later when the wagons rolled up. Just then the captain's tall form hovered over me. "Mr. Herriot?" The grave eyes looked down and he ran a finger over his beard. Again I felt the impact of a masterful personality. "Mr. Herriot, there are a few things I must do. I have to see about getting that engine repaired, and there is the hotel accommodation to arrange. I am leaving now, and I rely on you to supervise things here." "Okay," I replied. "Don't worry. I'll see that the animals are all right." He nodded slowly. "Good. Good." Then he swept the two farmers with his unsmiling gaze. "And that goes for you chaps too. I don't want any of you to leave this spot until the last cow's been taken away. You do understand me?" We mumbled our assent. I don't suppose many people would have tried to argue with Captain Birch. Anyway, the mention of the hotel had lit a cheerful spark in me as I remembered John Crook's description of his 5-star opulence. I am not attracted by continual luxury, but I do like a little bit now and again. Especially now. I was hot and sweaty and very hungry. The sandwiches at Gatwick were only a hazy memory, and the thought of a bath and a good meal was idyllic. I wanted the unloading to be as quick as possible. The farmers seemed to have the same idea because they already had the first batch of heifers on the hoist. Little Carl pulled a lever. There was a long, high-pitched whine, but nothing happened. He operated the lever again, with the same result. "The hoist?" "She is jammed," he said, and began to fiddle about with switches and other parts of the mechanism. Finally, he dealt the shining metal a vicious kick. He shrugged his shoulders and looked at us. "It's no good. I have to get electrician." He ambled off to the airport buildings, and the three of us were left looking at each other in some dismay. It was getting hotter by the minute. It was 10:30 before he returned with a man in white overalls who appeared determined to take the hoist to pieces. He muttered and exclaimed in Turkish all the time, and I just hoped he knew his business, because he was taking an age to find the cause of the trouble. Finally, after an hour and a half, the hoist answered to the pull on the lever and began to move. But we had lost a lot of time. Meanwhile, it was reassuring to see a party of mechanics working on the damaged engine. I hoped even more fervently that they knew their stuff. As Noel and Joe leapt into action and commenced the unloading, a party of Turkish vets arrived to inspect the animals. They were a most impressive group. Handsome, olive-skinned men in smart, lightweight suits, much more prosperous-looking than the average British vet. Only one of them spoke English, but he did so almost without accent. "Beautiful creatures, Mr. Herriot," he murmured, as the first cattle were ushered up the ramp into the wagons. The other vets, too, clucked their appreciation, and I felt personally proud that Britain could still lead the world in this field. So many countries had to turn to our green pastures to find livestock to improve their own strains. The head man explained that they were all government vets from the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture, and their job was to examine the animals for health and to ensure that all the ear numbers were correct. We both laughed heartily at this, because it seemed that in Turkey, an ear number is as world-shakingly important and sacrosanct as in England. The unloading was a painfully slow business. The electrician hadn't done a perfect job, because the hoist kept stopping in mid-air for tense periods while Carl tugged at the lever and swore, but it always restarted and the work went on. Fortunately, the animals' wagons were shaded by the hangar, because the sun was truly fierce. Also, they had water and some hay, so they were comfortable. The same could not be said of the farmers and myself. I was dirty, sweaty, unshaven, and starving, and I was only popping up and down from aircraft to ground, supervising things. How Joe and Noel felt wrestling with the cattle, I could not imagine. And all the time, Istanbul lay tantalizingly out of reach. As the hours wore on and the sun blazed, there was no sign of the captain, but the two young Americans, Ed and Dave, wandered over frequently to inspect the repairs on the engine. Occasionally they stopped and chatted to me about their life and job, and I found them most likeable men. They didn't seem to have a care in the world. They slouched around, smiling in their baggy suits, hands deep in their pockets. Those pockets, I was to find out later, were filled with the currency of a dozen nations. Pesetas rubbed shoulders with drachmas, guilders, lira, dimes, kronas, and shillings. They roamed the world in their old aircraft, free as birds, taking each day and new country as it came. And though hardly more than boys, they must have seen almost everything. They have remained in my mind as true soldiers of fortune. It was around 4 o'clock when the last heifer entered its wagon, and the Turkish vets were completing their examination. Noel came up to me. His shirt was a wet rag clinging to his chest, and he wiped his streaming face with his forearm. "I tell you, Jem," he said, "my stomach thinks my throat's cut." "Mine too, Noel," I replied. "I'm ravenous. I've gone nearly round the clock since the sandwiches at Gatwick." "I could murder a pint too," Joe put in. "Can't remember when I've had such a bloody thirst on." It seemed that our troubles weren't over yet. The vets were taking their time over the inspection, but at any rate there did not seem to be any complaints. They were clearly satisfied with what they saw. Unfortunately, this did not last. From our place under the Globemaster's wing, where we were sheltering from the sun, we saw a sudden stillness fall on the group of men. They were looking in a cow's ear and consulting a sheaf of papers again and again, and even from a distance I sensed the tension. Then there followed a consultation, followed by a lot of waving of arms. Finally, the head vet shouted across, "Mr. Herriot, come here, please." With the farmers, I walked over to the wagon. "Mr. Herriot," the man went on, "we have found a wrong number." His dark complexion had paled and his lips trembled. The expressions on the faces of the other men in the group were uniformly distraught. I groaned inwardly. The unthinkable had happened. One of the vets, upright and set-faced, waved me towards the offending cow with a dramatic gesture of his arm. I climbed into the wagon and looked in the ear. It was number 15. With the same theatrical flourish, the vet handed me the sheaf of papers. They contained the descriptions, ages, and numbers of the animals, and sure enough, no number 15. I smiled weakly. I wasn't sure whether this was my responsibility or not. I had checked off all the numbers on our own sheet when we loaded at Gatwick, and I thought they all tallied. Had I made some awful boob? It made it worse being so far from home. I turned to Joe. You brought that list from Jersey, didn't you? I did, Joe replied with an edge of belligerence in his voice. And it's correct. It's in my bag. Slip over and get it, will you, Joe? I said. We'll see if we can sort this out. The farmer strolled unhurriedly to the Globemaster, climbed inside, and duly returned with the sheet. Breathlessly, I scanned the list. There it is, I said triumphantly. Pedigree number, then number 15. Relief flowed through me. We were saved. The Turkish vet took Joe's list and retired for a further consultation. For a long time there was an incomprehensible chattering and much brandishing of arms, then apparently there was a unanimous decision. All the men nodded firmly and some of them folded their arms. The head man stepped forward, taut-faced. Mr. Herriot, we have concluded there is only one thing to do. You will understand that we have to follow our own list. There is no guarantee that this is the animal which we purchased originally, so with regret I have to tell you that you must take her back. Take her back? This was a bombshell. But that's impossible, I cried. This cow doesn't just come from England. She is from the island of Jersey. I can't see any way of doing what you say. I am sorry, he said, but nothing can change our decision. We cannot accept a wrong animal. How you do it is your concern, but you must take her back. But, I quavered. How do you know it's a wrong animal? The whole thing is probably a simple clerical error at your office. He drew himself up to his full height. He was a well-fleshed 6-footer, and he looked most impressive as he stared at me and held up his hand. Mr. Herriot, I repeat, what I have said is irrevocable. Well, you see, I was beginning to gabble when I felt Joe's hand on my arm. He eased me gently to one side and stepped up in front of the head vet. He put his hands on his hips and pushed his craggy, sweat-soaked face close to the man's moustache. His steady eyes held the imperious stare of the Turk for several seconds before he spoke. I ain't taking her back, mate, he said in his slow drawl. That's my job, and I ain't taking her back. The voice was soft, the words unhurried, but they held a wonderful note of finality, and the effect was dramatic. The big man's facade collapsed with startling suddenness. His whole face seemed to crumble, and he looked at Joe with an almost pathetic appeal. His mouth opened, and I thought he was going to say something, but instead he turned slowly and rejoined his friends. There was a murmured consultation, punctuated by shrugging of shoulders and sorrowful glances in the farmer's direction. Then the head man gave the signal for the wagons to move away. The battle was over. "Bless you, Joe," I said. "I thought we'd had it that time." We obeyed the captain's instructions and hung around till the cows had left the airfield. It pleased me to think they were heading for a good life. They were all going to top-class pedigree farms. In fact, they were animal VIPs. I was also pleased when my Turkish colleagues came up and bade us goodbye in the most cordial manner. I had an uncomfortable feeling that the incident might have spoiled their day, but they were all smiles and appeared to have recovered magically. I looked at my watch. 5 o'clock. We had been out on that oven of an airfield for 9 hours. It was actually 7 o'clock Turkish time, so the precious day was fast slipping away. I felt at the stubble on my chin. The first thing was a shave and a wash. With the farmers, I made my way over to the airport terminal, and in the men's room we stripped off, drank a lot of water, and made our ablutions. I have a vivid memory of a little man who kept dabbing talc on my bare back all the time. I thought he was working for a tip, but all he wanted was one of my razor blades, which I gave him. "That's better," Noel said as we came into the lounge. "If only we could get some grub. I'm famished." I knew how he felt. My appetite now was wolfish. But surely food couldn't be far away. This hope received a boost when we saw the towering form of Captain Birch striding towards us. "I've been looking for you, fellows," he said. "There are a few things I want to tell you. Come and sit down over here." We arranged ourselves on padded chairs round a small table, and the sombre eyes looked us over for a few moments before he spoke. "I don't know who's in charge of your party, but I'll address my remarks to you, Mr. Herriot." "Right. Now, I'm sorry to tell you that all attempts to rectify the oil leak in the engine have failed." "Oh. This means we will have to fly the aircraft on 3 engines to our headquarters in Copenhagen for major repairs." "I see. It also means that you chaps can't come with us." "What?" His expression softened. "I'm sorry to have to spring this on you, but the position is, frankly, that the aircraft is in an unsafe condition, and we are not allowed to carry passengers or any personnel but the crew." "But," I asked the obvious question, "how do we get home?" "I've been thinking about that," the captain replied. "The obvious thing is to contact the export company in London by telephone. I have their number here, and I'm sure they will make arrangements for you to be flown to England." "Well, thank you. I suppose that would be the thing to do." Another thought occurred to me. "You say the aircraft is unsafe?" The majestic head nodded gravely. "That is so." "In other words, you might never make Copenhagen." "Quite. There is that possibility. Flying over the Alps under these circumstances is going to be a little tricky." "But how about you? How about you and the crew?" "Ah, yes." He smiled, and suddenly he looked like a kind man. "It's good of you to ask, but this is our job. We have to go, don't you understand? It's our job." I turned to the farmers. "Well, I suppose we better do as the captain says." They nodded silently. They looked shattered, and I felt the same. But I took the point about that strange aeroplane. If one engine had given up, how reliable were the other 3? "I'd better find a phone, then. Will I do it from here or from the hotel?" The captain cleared his throat. "That's another thing I was going to mention. I haven't been able to find a hotel." "Eh?" "Afraid not," he said. "I've tried everywhere, but it's some kind of public holiday here, and all the hotels are booked." I had nothing to say to this. Everything was turning out great. "But don't worry," he went on. "I am assured that if we go a few miles up the Bosphorus, we'll find some little place which will put us up." Some little place. The visions of 5-star splendour evaporated rapidly. "Yes, of course." The captain smiled again, encouragingly. "I've got a minibus outside. We'll soon find somewhere." Dave and Ed were already installed in the little vehicle, lounging comfortably in their silky suits. "Hi," they said cheerfully. "Hi," said little Carl, grinning at us from the back seat. Such contretemps were no doubt part of their normal lives, and they were taking everything in their stride. I made a sudden resolve to do the same. Things were looking a bit sticky, but I was here in Istanbul, and I was going to enjoy what little time I had. I fished out my camera. I had taken some pictures of the flight and of the Globemaster during the unloading. Even if it was a fleeting thing, I would capture some memories of this city. As the minibus shot through the streets, I snapped away like mad, and when I wasn't snapping, I was devouring the scene greedily. The knowledge that I was going to have only a short time in these surroundings made every new spectacle imprint itself on my mind. As we sped through the teeming traffic on that gloriously sunny evening, exquisite mosques and minarets towered incongruously over modern tenements. Then, unexpectedly, there would be a long stretch of waste ground with stubbly scorched grass and garish billboards. Tremendous stone aqueducts, ancient and overgrown, appeared briefly in our windows and were gone before I could do more than catch them on my film. The massive ruins of the walls of old Constantinople, the crumbling fortresses on the shattered walls. I glimpsed them briefly, but even today, among my photographs, I can still look at the slightly blurred images beyond the smeared glass. Among all these wonders eddied the Istanbul street scene. The vendors of coloured cordials, sweetmeats and peaches. The dark-skinned pedestrians in Kemal Ataturk's obligatory westernised clothes. The women in cotton dresses, the men in an outfit of shirt and slacks so unvarying that it looked like a uniform. Soon we were running along the side of the Bosphorus. Surely one of the most beautiful and romantic waterways in the world. Wide and blue, bounded by tree-lined hills where elegant houses and even palaces nestled. Families sunned themselves on chairs on the little beaches, while out on the water a great variety of craft lay at anchor. There were large modern ships, fishing smacks, and some wonderful old wooden vessels. I had a fair opportunity to view the Bosphorus because we kept stopping in our efforts to find accommodation. At last we were successful, and we climbed out of the minibus in front of a small building. It wasn't Claridge's, nor was it a flea pit. It was an unpretentious little hotel up a side street. The members of the staff were friendly and cheerful, but I had a strong impression that they couldn't care less whether we stayed there or not. I managed to communicate to the manager that I wanted to telephone London. Smilingly, he assured me that I would have to go to the local post office for that, and said there was a taxi nearby. The taxi whirled me through the streets with the same reckless speed as our minibus driver. There is something I had noticed straight away. All traffic seemed to proceed at about 70 miles an hour. At the post office, I explained my needs to a fat little lady who nodded and smiled repeatedly. She knew enough English to assure me that all would be well. She lifted a phone and made inquiries. Turning back to me, she beamed happily. "Long wait, maybe hour. You go hotel, I send taxi." When I got back to the hotel, all my colleagues had been installed in rooms. There seemed to be no reception desk, so I asked various members of the staff where I was to sleep. My queries were received with uncomprehending shrugs until I found the manager again. He seemed to take a certain amount of pleasure in telling me that there was no room for me, but my obvious dismay softened his heart because he took me downstairs and showed me into a cell-like apartment in the basement, where he left me. There was a single unmade bed with a rumpled pile of old blankets on a chair in a corner. That was all, but I was thankful for it. The bathroom was a long, long way away. But then all my senses were submerged by one thing: the smell of food. A rich, spicy aroma was beginning to pervade the little place, and I began to stumble towards its source. I suppose eating nothing for more than 24 hours is an unimportant detail to people who go on diets and visit health farms, but I have always believed in a regular, hearty intake, and at that moment I was more ravenous than I have ever been in my life. I found the dining room where the crew and the farmers were already at the table, and as I sat down with them, the glorious victuals began to arrive. Great heaped-up plates of kebabs resting on beds of saffron rice and peppers, steaming bowls of mixed vegetables, and an abundance of coarse Turkish bread. I love bread, and I bit into this stuff immediately. It was delicious, and Ed laughed as he saw my expression. "It's good, isn't it?" he said. "It's got sunflower seeds in it." Whether it had or it hadn't, it was some of the best bread I've ever tasted. But I couldn't wait to get at the serious eating, and I was posing my fork over the skewer laden with chunks of assorted meats when the taxi driver burst into the room. "Mr. Herriot, come quick! Phone! Phone!" I could have wept. To have my food snatched from me before I had even started was too much. But this was important. I dropped my fork and hurried out. Once more I was swept at breakneck speed to the post office where the fat lady, still all smiles, indicated the phone. I tried a lot of "hello, hello" before I heard anything, and then it was a faint voice in the crackling distance. "Mr. Herriot? Mr. Herriot?" I replied with a "Yes, yes, Herriot speaking." But that was as far as I got. I don't want to bore anybody with a detailed account of my session with that phone. Sufficient to say that it lasted about 3/4 of an hour, and was made up of long silences, hopeful clicks and crackles, and every few minutes that tiny voice, "Mr. Herriot?" My desperate outbursts were totally wasted. Only once was there a shaft of light in the darkness, when a very English female voice said loudly, as though from the same room, "Oh God, I can't hear a thing!" That was evidently London, and I set up an almost tearful yammering reply, but the silence came down again, and though I waited hopefully, the voice never came back. As I looked out at the gathering dusk in the street, the realization grew on me that I was never going to get through. I thanked the fat lady and left. At the hotel, I didn't know how much to pay the taxi driver, so I held out a handful of notes. A huge grin split his face as he selected a few. But before he could get them into his pocket, a little man, apparently one of the staff, dashed down the steps and grabbed the money from him. He reduced the amount by about half, which he handed back to me. Then he shook his fist in the man's face and showered him with eloquent abuse before getting out of the car. The driver's big grin never slipped, and he bade me good night with a courteous wave of the hand before leaving. I thanked my benefactor, but as I passed into the hotel, my spirits were touching zero. I was stranded in Istanbul, with no prospect of ever returning to hearth and home. My relaxing trip to the Orient had so far turned out to be a fairly steady-going fiasco. I was hungrier than I'd ever been in my life, and I had missed my supper. On top of that, I wasn't looking forward to telling my two nice farmers that I had failed them. Not my fault, of course, but it had been left to me to organise something, and I was coming back empty-handed. Joe and Noel were waiting for me in the dining room. I was touched that they were more concerned about my food than their immediate future. Noel leapt to his feet. "We asked them to keep it warm for you, Jim," he cried, and ran from the room. Within minutes he was back with a tray with the entire meal, including the gorgeous bread. They watched in silence as I devoured everything down to the last crumb. Then they looked at me expectantly. "I'm sorry, chaps," I said. "I had no joy there." I gave them details of my 45 minutes in the post office. When I had finished my story, they looked pretty glum. Joe stared down at his knees. "What the hell are we going to do, Jim?" A few minutes ago, I would have been compelled to say I had no idea. But maybe the food had stimulated my brain, because suddenly everything became clear. "I didn't bring much with me from home," I said, "but I did bring a checkbook. I'll go to the BEA desk at the airport tomorrow and get 3 tickets to London. The export company will reimburse me later. It's obvious, isn't it? There was no need for all that phoning tonight." The mood of our little company cheered magically, and we were doing a bit of mutual backslapping when I saw the captain passing the doorway. I ran out and told him our plan. "Yes," he said seriously. "That sounds like a good scheme." He paused and looked at his watch. "The only alternative would be to go to the British consul, but it's after 9 now. I don't suppose they'll be able to arrange anything at this time of night. And we're taking off at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. No, I think yours is the best idea." When he had gone, we were gripped by a frothy elation. "We got nothing to worry about, Jim boy," said Joe. "So we might as well enjoy ourselves. I could still murder that pint. So let's go out on the town and enjoy ourselves." Joe's pint was our immediate goal, and there was no doubt we were 3 country cousins, because searching for a pub in a Muslim city is a fruitless venture. But, full of enthusiasm, we piled into a taxi. The nightlife in Istanbul seemed to be just getting into its stride. The streets were crowded, and the traffic had, if possible, speeded up after dark. Our taxi catapulted between other hurtling vehicles, the driver exchanging a running fire of shouted insults with his colleagues. I was relieved when he deposited us in what we hoped was the city centre. Immediately in the warm darkness, I was reminded that we were in the Orient. I could see nothing now of the romantic buildings and ruins, only the lighted shop windows, but the air was filled with mysterious scents, and over everything hung the heavy aroma of Turkish tobacco. My other overriding impression was the noise. An unbroken, strident chorus of automobile horns of every conceivable pitch, punctuated by the screeching of brakes and the roar of engines. In our search for a pub, we gazed into the windows of many interesting shops. Some were selling rugs and other souvenirs of the area, and I was intrigued by the large number of bakers who were turning out very sweet-looking cakes and confections and doing a brisk trade. We stuck to one side of the street because it seemed like suicide to head into that boiling torrent of vehicles. There were, in fact, pedestrian crossings, but I noticed only one unfortunate little man trying to negotiate one. He was about halfway across when, to my horror, a car struck him and sent him flying high in a tangle of arms and legs. In Britain, that motorist would have been heavily fined and received a dressing down from the magistrates. But as I watched, a large, helmeted policeman loomed over the injured victim, who stood trembling in his inevitable shirt and slacks and rubbing his backside. The policeman shook his truncheon over the little man's head and bawled out a flood of vituperation, which was unintelligible to me except for one word which sounded very like stupido and vividly reflected his attitude in the matter. He never even looked at the driver of the car. "Hey, look, Jem," Joe nudged me. "There's a lot of fellas going in there. How about that?" Joe's quest for a pint was becoming an obsession. So I acquiesced and followed him through a doorway and up a long staircase. We came out on an open balcony, which was really the flat roof of the shop beneath, and to the farmer's disgust, scores of shirt-sleeved men were sitting at tables, smoking and drinking coffee out of tiny cups. We would have retreated then, but a waiter was upon us, so we sat down and ordered the coffee. It was very thick and very sweet, and both Joe and Noel screwed up their faces, but I rather liked it. I also enjoyed just sitting there above the roar and smell of the city, taking in the atmosphere of the place. In my hurried visit to Istanbul, this is one of my persisting memories, and, rightly or wrongly, it appealed to me as a typical scene. After the coffee, we resumed our tour of the streets, with Joe becoming more depressed by the minute. Then he suddenly gave tongue. "Look in there, lads. That's a bit more like it." He pointed through a window at a big, brightly lit room, where a large number of men and women were sitting around drinking from tall glasses. There wasn't a coffee cup in sight. He did not hesitate, but opened a swing door and bustled inside with Noel and I following. We sat down at a vacant table and Joe beckoned to a waiter. "Drink, drink," he said, and when the man's face registered polite incomprehension, he made the unmistakable motion of raising a glass to his lips. The waiter smiled immediately and brought a tray bearing 3 tumblers of bright red liquid. I offered him money, but he shook his head, laughed, and walked away. "What the hell's this?" Joe grunted. He tried a sip and pulled a face worse than over the coffee. "It's bloody lemonade," he spluttered. I tried it myself. It wasn't lemonade. It was a bland, syrupy concoction, sickly sweet and obviously non-alcoholic. It was too sugary for me, but Noel, who I suspected wasn't much of a drinker, seemed to enjoy it. "All right, this," he said, imbibing contentedly. Joe looked at him in disgust. Like me, he could not tackle the stuff, whatever it was, and with an air of defeat he flopped back in his chair. Within a few minutes the same waiter came back with a dish of cakes and pastries and laid them before us. Again he refused any money and walked away laughing and shaking his head. Biting into one of the sticky cakes, I found it had the same characteristic as the coffee and the coloured drinks. It seemed to me that a sweet tooth would be a prerequisite for anybody living in Istanbul. However, it was an interesting scene. The big room was crowded with beautifully dressed people. I noticed that most of the women wore white evening gowns, and they nibbled the cakes and drank from glasses like ours, not only bright red liquid, but equally brilliant blue, green, and yellow. When I saw that several children were present, something began to stir in the back of my mind. The children were playing among the tables, and some of the adults were moving from group to group as though they knew everybody. "Hey, wait a minute," I said. "Do you know what I think?" Joe gave me a sideways glance. "What?" "I think this is a private party and we've gatecrashed it." Both the farmers sat up suddenly as I went on. "Those kids down there, and all the people seem to be friends. And remember that waiter who thought it was funny to be offered money?" Just at that moment a handsome young couple appeared at the far end of the room, the man in a dark suit, the girl in a glittering spangled bridal gown. "My God," I said, "it's a wedding reception." And it was, indeed. The newlyweds moved around among their guests, and when they reached us, I half expected to be thrown out. But on the contrary, they seemed to regard our presence as a gracious courtesy visit. They bowed and shook hands with us and made us welcome with smiles and gestures. Before they moved on, the bride gave each of us a long silver thread. She did this with some ceremony, and I deduced that it was an honoured local custom, the thread having possibly been taken from her gown. In any case, I took it in this spirit, and I carried that thread in my wallet for many years thereafter, until it gradually disintegrated. We were still recovering from our surprise when 2 men in traditional Turkish dress appeared on a stage at the other end of the room. They were obviously entertainers, and comedians to boot, because very soon the room was echoing with laughter. It was strange for the 3 of us sitting there to hear the totally unintelligible crosstalk, followed by roars of mirth, the little children jumping up and down and clapping their hands in delight. They were versatile chaps, those two. When they had finished being funny, one of them produced a one-string fiddle and began to play, while the other sang in that peculiar wail which is associated only with eastern countries. I had no way of telling whether it was a love song, a happy song, or a sad song. But as I listened to that strange ululation going on, I felt very far from home. It was about then that my eyelids began to droop. I remembered that I'd had only 2 hours sleep last night, and that rather a lot had happened in a short time. I was very tired, and when I turned to look at my farmer friends, I saw that Joe was nodding and Noel was slumbering peacefully, his chin on his chest. I stood up and suggested we ought to leave. They didn't need much persuading. Back in the hotel, I descended to my basement room and made up the bed from the pile of blankets on the chair. I would have fallen asleep immediately, but from somewhere quite close at hand came the same wailing which I had heard at the wedding reception. At first, I thought I was dreaming. But then I realized there was a party going on in one of the hotel rooms. It was a noisy party, too, with screams of laughter, outbursts of music, thumping of dancing feet. It went on, and it must have been the middle of the night before the din subsided and I fell into an exhausted sleep. Chapter 33. I stood, head bowed, leaning on my great guillotine which stood chest high. It occurred to me that my pose was exactly that of the executioner resting against his axe, as I'd seen in old pictures of the beheading of Sir Walter Raleigh and other unfortunates. However, I wasn't wearing a hood. I was standing in a deep strawed fold yard, not on a scaffold, and I was waiting for a bullock to be dehorned, not for a hapless victim to lay his head upon the block. In the 50s, bovine horns quite suddenly went out of fashion. To veterinary surgeons and most farmers, their passing was unlamented. Horns were at best a nuisance, at worst, extremely dangerous. They worked their way under vets' coats and pulled off the buttons and tore out pockets. They could whip round and bash the hand, arm, or even the head of a man, injecting the neck. And of course, in the case of a really wild cow or bull, they could be instruments of death. Horns were a menace, too, to other bovines. Some cows and bullocks were natural bullies, and one animal could impose a reign of terror on its more timid neighbours, driving them away viciously from food troughs in open yards, and inflicting savage wounds on any who resisted. The farmers in Yorkshire used to call these injuries hypes, and they ranged from massive hematoma over the ribs to deep lacerations of the udder. It was strange how a boss cow would always go for the udder, and the results were often ruinous. Since the passing of horns, you never hear the word hype now. There were farmers, notably pedigree breeders, who attached great importance to well-set horns, and pointed out that a neat, cocky little horn looked well in the show ring, and that their highly bred animals would be disfigured. But their voices were lost in the tumult of abolition. One down-to-earth dairyman said to me at the time, "You don't get much milk out of a bloody horn." And that seemed to be the general attitude. From my own point of view, the only thing I missed was that convenient handle to get hold of a cow. For many years I had smacked one hand down on the horn, then pushed the fingers of the other hand into the nose. But after the dehorning revolution, there was nothing to grasp. Most cows were expert at tucking their noses down on the ground or round the other side where you couldn't get at them, but that was a small thing. So by and large, the disappearance of these dangerous and largely useless appendages was a great blessing, but oh dear, there was one tremendous snag. The horns didn't just go away by themselves. They had to be removed by the vets, and that removal wrote a gory and ham-fisted chapter in veterinary history which still hangs like a dark cloud in my memory. I suppose Siegfried and I reacted just like other members of our profession. As the situation arose and we looked out on a countryside apparently dominated by a waving forest of horns, we wondered how we would start. Was it to be general or local anesthesia? Did we saw them off or chop them off? In the beginning, the chop school appeared to hold sway because there were many advertisements in the veterinary record for villainous-looking guillotines. We ordered one of these, but we both experienced a sense of shock when we unpacked it. As I said, it was nearly as tall as a man, and its weight was frightening. Siegfried, groaning slightly, hefted the thing by its long wooden handles till the huge sliding blades were at eye level. Then he lowered it quickly and leant against the wall. He took a long, shuddering breath. "Hell! You need to be a trained athlete just to lift that bloody thing." He paused in thought. "There's no doubt we'll need something like that for the big beasts, but surely we can find something else for the little sturks." He raised a finger. "James, I believe I know the very thing." "You do?" "Yes. I saw some nice light hedge clippers in Albert Kenning's window yesterday. I bet they'd do the job. Tell you what, let's go round and try them." When Siegfried had one of his ideas, he didn't mess about. Within seconds, we were hurrying, almost a trot, through the marketplace to the ironmonger's. I followed close on Siegfried's heels as he burst into the shop. "Albert!" he shouted. "Those hedge clippers! Let's have a look at them!" They certainly looked all right. Round, gleaming wooden shafts terminating in small, curved blades, which crossed each other scissor-wise. Yes," I said. "Do you think they'll be strong enough to cut through a little horn?" "Only one way to find out." Siegfried brandished his new weapon. "Fetch me one of those canes, Albert." The little man turned towards a bundle of thick bamboos which were on sale for tying up flowers and shrubs. "These? That's right, look sharp." Albert selected a cane and brought it over. "Now, hold it out towards me," Siegfried said. No, upright, that's fine." Starting at the top, he began to clip off inch lengths of the bamboo at lightning speed. The fragments flew in all directions, and Albert had to duck several times as they flew past his ears. But he was more anxious about his hand as the blades worked rapidly downwards. Apprehensively, he kept lowering his grasp until Siegfried made his final slash an inch above his thumb. Holding the tiny stump at arm's length, he looked wide-eyed at my colleague. But Siegfried wasn't finished yet. He continued to chop away at the air, obviously enjoying his work. "Let's have another one, Albert." Wordlessly, the little man produced a second cane, half-closed his eyes, and held it as far away from his body as possible. My colleague recommenced his onslaught with such vigour that the woody cylinders whizzed around the shop like machine-gun bullets. A customer, entering by the door, backed away and took cover behind a stack of milking buckets. Albert had gone pale by the time Siegfried demolished the second cane, finishing once more just above the little man's thumb. "Grand little machine, this, James." Siegfried hesitated, tried a few more practice snips, then turned to the ironmonger. "Just one more, Albert." "Really, Mr. Farnan, don't you think—" Come on, we've got work to do, don't hang about." This time the little man's jaw dropped and the cane wobbled uncontrollably in his grasp. Siegfried, obviously determined to make the most of this last test, put everything into his effort, and his movements were almost too rapid to follow. There was a brief fusillade of clippings, then Albert was left breathless, clutching his small remnant. "Splendid!" Siegfried cried happily. "We'll take it. How much?" 12 and 6, gasped the ironmonger. "And the canes?" Another shilling." My colleague delved in his pocket and pulled out a handful of notes, coins, and small veterinary instruments. "There's a quid among that lot, Albert. Help yourself." Tremblingly, the little man extracted the pound from Siegfried's palm, then crunched over the carpet of bamboo clippings to get change. Siegfried crammed the money into his pocket without looking and tucked his new purchase under his arm. "Goodbye, Albert, and thank you," he said, and we left. As I passed the shop window at a brisk pace, I could see the ironmonger following us wonderingly with his eyes. The hedge clippers did indeed perform nobly for us with the smaller bovines, but there were so many other complications. For a long time, we used general anaesthesia by means of the chloroform muzzle, and when the animal collapsed unconscious, we whipped the horns off quickly. But we found to our dismay that the hemorrhage was massive and terrifying. Red jets fountained several feet in the air, spraying everything and everybody for yards around. In those days, you could always tell when a vet had been out dehorning because his collar and face were spattered with blood. An ingenious tourniquet was devised by laying a length of binder twine long ways to the inside of each horn, then encircling both horns with another piece of twine. By knotting the first two tightly over the encircling one, the arteries were effectively compressed and hemorrhage was nil. But then often the chopping blade severed the twine, and we were in trouble again. As time passed, two advances emerged. The first was that by removing the horn by sawing, and taking about half an inch of skin with it, there was virtually no bleeding. The second was that local anaesthesia was infinitely easier and more effective. It was quite simple to inject a few cc's of local under the temporal ridge and into the branch of the fifth cranial nerve which supplies the horn. There was nothing to it, and it gave a perfect nerve block. The animal couldn't feel a thing. I have seen cows chewing their cud while I sawed away, and this merciful improvement in our method signalled the end of all the old things. The horrible choppers and guillotines and tourniquets disappeared almost overnight. Nowadays, of course, a horn is rarely seen anywhere because calves are painlessly disbodied early in life using this same nerve block. But as I say, the whole period of adult dehorning left a scar on my memory, and it was during the guillotine period that Andrew Bruce came to visit me. For several years after the war, people were still renewing contact with each other. The war brought the normal lives of so many people to a full stop that the ensuing period was a time of taking stock, of looking around and wondering what had happened to one's friends. Andrew and I had not met since our school days, and I hardly recognized the dark-suited, bowler-hatted figure on the doorstep. It turned out that he was doing very nicely in a bank in Glasgow and was on a business trip down south when he saw the sign to Darrowby and decided to pay me a call. A lot of my schoolmates seem to have gone into banking, and since I've always had to use my fingers for counting, I regarded these men with a certain amount of awe. "I don't know how you do it, Andy," I said after lunch. "I wouldn't last a couple of days in your job." He shrugged and smiled. "Oh, it's meat and drink to me. I loved maths at school, if you remember." "Oh, yes," I shivered. "That's right. You used to get prizes for dreadful things like trigonometry." We chatted for a few minutes over our coffee, then I stood up. "I'm afraid I've got to go," I said. "I've got to be on a farm by 2:15. "Okay, Jim." He hesitated for a moment. "Do you think I could come with you? I've never seen a country vet at work, and I could easily drive to Birmingham this evening." I smiled. So many people wanted to accompany me on my rounds. There seemed to be some fascination in the veterinary life. "Of course you can, Andy, but I don't think you'll find it very entertaining. All I have is an afternoon's dehorning." "Really? Well, sounds interesting. I'd love to come if you don't mind." I found a spare pair of Wellingtons for him and we got into the car. As we drove away, I noticed him looking around him, at the boxes of bottles and instruments on the back seat, at my clothes, which contrasted so sharply with his own natty outfit. At that time, I had discarded the breeches and leggings which were almost a vet's uniform when I qualified, and now wore brown corduroy trousers with a sort of canvas jacket, which had been made for me by a German prisoner of war and which I had cherished for years. The corduroys were frayed and stiffened with mud and muck, and the jacket, too, despite the protective clothing which I always wore, bore ample evidence of my trade. I could see Andy's nostrils wrinkling as he took in the rich bouquet of manure, dog hairs, and assorted chemicals which was the normal atmosphere in my car. But after a few minutes he appeared to forget everything as he gazed out of the window. It was a golden afternoon in October, and beyond the stone walls the fell sides, ablaze with their mantle of dead bracken, rose serenely into a deep, unbroken blue. We passed under a long canopy of tinted leaves thrown over us by the roadside trees. Then followed a stretch of white, pebbled river before turning along a narrow track which led up the hillside. Andrew was silent as we climbed into the stark, airy solitude which is the soul of the Dales. But as the track levelled out on the summit, he put a hand on my arm. "Stop a minute, Jim, will you?" he said. I pulled up and wound down the window. For a few moments he looked out over the miles of heathery moorland and the rounded summits of the great hills slumbering in the sunshine. Then he spoke, quietly as though to himself. "So this is where you work?" "Yes, this is it, Andy." He took a long breath, then another as if greedy for more. "You know," he said, "I've heard a lot about air like wine, but this is the first time I've realized what it means." I nodded. I always felt I could never get enough of that air. Sharp and cool, and tinged only with the grass scent which lingers in the high country. "Well, you're a lucky beggar, Jim," Andrew said with a touch of weariness. "You spend your life driving around in country like this, and I'm stuck in a damned office. I thought you liked your job." He ran a hand through his hair. "Oh, yes, I suppose playing around with figures is what I'm best at, but, oh, hell. I have to do it all inside. In fact," he said, becoming a little worked up, "when I start to think about it, I live and have my being in a bloody centrally heated box with no windows and electric light blasting down all day, and I share what passes for air with a whole crowd of other people." He slumped back in his seat. "Makes me wish I hadn't come out with you." "I'm sorry, Andy." He laughed ruefully. "Oh, I didn't really mean that. But honestly, this is idyllic." At the end of the moor, the land dipped into a lush valley where the herd of Mr. Dunning grazed and grew fat on the abundant grass around the farm buildings. The Dunnings were not dairymen, as was usual in the Dales, but raised beef cattle, and they did so on a large scale, with more than 200 animals under their care. I had been there for the last few afternoons, dehorning, and I was glad that this was my last visit, because the bullocks on which I had been operating were massive 3-year-old shorthorns, and I'd had a rough time. Nowadays, with the housewife's preference for smaller, leaner joints, most beef cattle are slaughtered at around 18 months, and the kind of huge creatures I had to face at Mr. Dunning's are rarely seen. As we drove into the farmyard, there were about 20 of them milling around in a collecting pen. "We'll run 'em into the fold yard one at a time, as usual," Mr. Dunning cried as he trotted towards me. He was a small, excitable man, bursting with energy, and his voice seldom fell below a piercing shout. His sons, large young men with the classical Dales names of Thomas, James, and William, followed more slowly. I introduced Andy, and he gazed with interest at the enormous boots, the work-worn clothes, and the tangle of hair pushing from under the caps. The farmers, in turn, seemed similarly intrigued with my friend's pinstripes, gleaming white collar, and tasteful tie. Once the action commenced, Mr. Dunning launched into full cry, poking at the beast's rumps with his stick and emitting shrill yelps of, "Hey! Hey! Cush! Cush! Get on there!" Finally, one of the bullocks trotted into the fold yard, and the brothers guided it into a loose box. I handed the chloroform muzzle into them, and leant on my mighty guillotine, thinking how much easier life had become over the past few days. At the start of this session, I had applied every tourniquet myself, then buckled on the muzzle before putting the halter over the top. But farmers are very adaptable people, and the brothers soon devised a better way. On the second day, Thomas, the eldest, made a quiet suggestion. "We could put on them bands and the muzzle ourselves, Mr. Herriot, while you wait outside box." I leapt happily at the idea. That rough binder twine had to be pulled very tight, and my soft palms had been rubbed sore. But the horny fingers of the Dunning boys would be impervious to such a detail. Also, I would not be thrown around in the tying process. As I leant there, feeling again like an executioner, I bethought myself of my friend. "Andy," I said, "I think it would be a good idea if you climbed up there." I pointed to one of a long row of square wooden feeding troughs, known as tumblers, which stretched down the middle of the straw-covered yard. Above them, running the full length of the tumblers, a hay-rack dangled on chains. He smiled indulgently. "Oh, I'll be all right here." He rested a shoulder against the post opposite the box and lit a cigarette. "I don't want to miss anything, and anyway, it sounds very interesting in there." It did indeed sound interesting behind the wooden doors of the box. It always did. Gruff outbursts of, "Ow! Stand still, you bugger! Get off me foot!" blended with tremendous crashes as the big beast hurled itself against the timbers. At length came the inevitable volley of yells. "Right! He's coming out!" I tensed myself as the doors were thrown wide and the great animal, festooned with binder twine and wearing the muzzle like a wartime gas mask, catapulted outwards with two of the brothers hanging grimly to the halter. As the bullock felt the straw around its knees, it paused for a moment in its headlong rush and looked around till the eyes, glaring above the rim of the muzzle, focused on the elegant form of my friend leaning against the post. Then it put its head down and charged. Andy, confronted by 1,400 weights of hairy beef hurtling towards him, did not linger. He vaulted onto the tumbler, grabbed the slats of the hay rack and swung himself to safety as the horn sent the tumbler crashing away beneath his feet. I recalled that he had been very good on the wall bars in the school gymnasium, and it was apparent that he had lost none of his agility. Cradled in the fragrant clover, he looked down at me as the rack swung gently to and fro on its change. "I'd stay up there if I were you," I said. Andy nodded. I could see he didn't need much persuading. He had lost a little colour, and his eyebrows were arched high on his forehead. All three of the Dunning brothers were needed to bring the bullock to a halt, and they stood there leaning back on the rope and breathing heavily as they waited for me to make the next move. This was the tricky bit. I leant the guillotine against the tumbler and slowly approached the beast. Opening the front of the muzzle, I trickled chloroform onto the sponge. At this moment, I never knew what was going to happen. Some animals turned sleepy almost immediately, while others, on inhaling the strange vapour, seemed to resent my presence and took a sudden dive at me, and in the deep straw it was difficult to get out of the way.
Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed listening to your audiobook.